If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Groundhog Day so that we can study the middle of stories. This 1993 film was directed by Harold Remis from a screenplay that he co-wrote with Danny Rubin. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we'd love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page, scroll to the bottom, and leave the review. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, so what have you got for the stories genre this week?
Alrighty. I think this is a redemption story with a love story as a secondary genre. Although, to be honest, that love story feels more like a subplot. Maybe because it's such a short film, I don't know. But that's what I'm going with. What about you?
Yeah, I had the same, actually. I had a morality story because Phil must move from selfishness to altruism. And for the secondary genre, as much as I hate to say it, it felt like it's a love courtship story because it feels like Phil's reward at the end of that is a romance with Rita. So I had the same as you.
There really isn't a lot of story development here this week. I mean, obviously, yes, Phil changes. That's undeniable. But instead of the shift happening incrementally, it happens very quickly at the end of Act 2. And it's almost a bit hard to believe it's so sudden. So hopefully why I'm saying that and why I've come to that conclusion will be obvious once I've finished my little bit here. Okay, so this season I'm looking at the middle of stories, so Act 2. We're looking at Groundhog Day. It's a short movie. Like I said, it's only 98 minutes. The beginning is 18%, the middle is 59%, and the end is 23%. All right, so why did I choose this movie? Well, when we're writing a story, our main goal is obviously to hold the reader's attention, right? And keep them engaged and keep them turning pages all the way to the end. Therefore, one of the things we need to do is constantly give them something new to read by giving the protagonist something new, some new challenge, something new to face. We never want to repeat the same challenges in the same way with the same outcome. Now, this sounds obvious when I say it like that, but you'd be surprised how many times this kind of thing pops up in manuscripts by new writers. And there's a really practical reason for why this is true, why we don't want to have repeats. And here it is. If what the reader thinks will happen actually happens, she'll lose interest in the story. The story is going to bore her. Okay, so here's a bit of tough love for you. Your reader doesn't care that being a published author is your dream. She doesn't care that you spent 5 years working on the book. She doesn't care that you took a leave of absence from work to finish the manuscript or that the publisher only gave you a low 4 figures for it. And pro tip here, if she really does love your book, there's a small chance that she'll remember the title and a huge chance that she'll forget your name. I know I sound like a Grinch. I know that. I really do know that. But this is the nature of the business. And I think it's really important to share the reality of the business with everybody so that you know what you're in for, so that you come to this with your eyes open. Now, I don't want you to take my word for it, though. I want you to do your own research on this. Here's an exercise for you. Try asking some of your friends about the last 5 books they've read. Ask them what the title was. Ask them what the author's name was. And for yourself, try to name the authors of the last dozen books you read. And yes, I am making the bar higher for you because you're a writer. My guess is this. If they or you remember the names, it's because the book was written by an A-list author with a household name. That's kind of how it goes. So given that the repeating challenges or repeating complications thing is a no-no, I wanted to see what Harold Remis did in Groundhog Day, given that the whole premise of this movie is that the same day repeats over and over and over again. Okay, so how are the repeats in Act 2, or the middle build of the story, how are they handled? Well, the second act begins by exactly repeating the events that we saw when Groundhog Day happened the first time. And it kind of looks, at first blush, like Harold Remis is breaking this rule that I just talked about, right? Well, this is the beauty of storytelling. He's not actually breaking the quote unquote rule. He's bending it in order to serve the story. And everything is in service of the story. Now, what that means is that all of the decisions we make in terms of the craft, we're asking ourselves which choice helps us tell the story. Now, I just want to go off on a little tangent here for a second. Baz Luhrmann actually talks about this very thing when he's talking about his movie Elvis. I saw an interview with him recently, and the journalist asked him how he chose which of Elvis's hits to include and which ones to exclude. And he answered that he chose the songs that helped him tell Elvis's story best. And then he expanded to talk about how the other elements of storytelling, the casting, the costume design, the script, and all that other stuff that he's working with, how when making decisions in any of those areas, his guiding light, the thing that he focused on was which of these options helps me tell the story best. So everything is in service of the story. Melanie, did you have anything you wanted to add there before I moved on?
No, I think that's a good point to draw out, because I do think that Remis does this very well in Groundhog Day. It's very neat movie. Do you know what I mean? Everything is in service of the story, and it really doesn't go off track. So and you can really see it, especially if you compare it to other stories that we might be doing analysis of soon, where it kind of goes off track. So I think that that's a really good point that you've drawn out. And I just recently saw Elvis 2, and I could see what Baz Luhrmann did it. But I think he's a master storyteller, right? All of his movies are really, he has a very strong understanding and passion for the craft of visual storytelling. But I think it's a really good point to draw out, that keeping that guiding light of what serves your story best, if you do that, you won't go far wrong. And it's a matter of discipline, right? To try and do that and do it well.
It is, but listen, if it's good enough for Baz Luhrmann, it's good enough for me. All right, back to Groundhog Day. All right, so why might Harold Remis have chosen to kick off Act 2 with an exact repeat of Groundhog Day? Well, it's because he's establishing the story's premise to the audience. Because the whole day is repeating, it catches our attention and it makes us wonder what's going on. We're like Phil in that moment. It's all very strange and we're not quite sure what's happening or where this is all going, but we're paying attention. So the function of this first repeat is to establish the stakes of the story. Now, Act 2 is kind of late to be doing that. And I'm willing to bet that Harold Remis knew this. Remember, the typical breakdown for a story is 25% of the story is Act 1, 50% of the story is Act 2, and 25% is Act 3. But Act 1 of Groundhog Day is only 18% of the story, right? So even though the stakes are established in the second act, they're still falling within that first 25% of the story. So from a viewer's perception, it's feeling okay. In terms of linear time, watching time, viewing time of the movie, it's still falling in the same time period that they're used to it falling in. So far, so good. So this is why we need to understand storytelling fundamentals. We need to know how they work and why they exist and why they work that way. So we know how to bend and shape them while making sure that they still work. Okay, so Remis follows this first repeat with a second repeat, but he's already making important changes. He's not simply giving us the original Groundhog Day for a third time. At the end of the first repeat, Phil broke a pencil. It's an experiment that he's conducting to see, how is this whole thing working? Is it actually happening? Am I losing my mind? What's going on here? The second repeat, when he wakes up, on that second morning, it begins with the pencil being whole, being in one piece. So, like Phil, we, the audience, are realizing that the clock and his whole life is actually resetting each time. Now, the second repeat is heavily abbreviated. But even in a heavily abbreviated version, it gets monotonous already because we've seen it twice. So what Remis does is move the story very quickly along by just giving us an abbreviated version of those, Phil reporting on Groundhog Day events. And then he gives us new actions, right? So Phil's freaking out here. I mean, like you would. So he goes to see two different doctors. The stakes are being raised here. So on the first repeat, the stakes were established. And here on the second repeat, already they're being raised. Because here, Phil genuinely thinks he's losing his mind. And there's a great joke here, too, with the guys in the bowling alley when Phil asks them, what would you do if you were stuck in one place and every day was exactly the same and nothing that you did mattered? Well, for Phil, it's Groundhog Day, right? Like, this is not his normal life. But these poor dudes in the bowling alley, that's normal for them, right? That is what they do. Now, when it dawns on Phil that there aren't any consequences to his behavior, he has what I call a Kevin McAllister moment. And remember Kevin McAllister from Home Alone? And I bet when we look at any movie that has this sort of premise where the protagonist is sort of waking up one morning to find that his whole world has completely changed, I'm willing to bet that in other stories that have that same premise, that we're going to see what we see in Home Alone and Groundhog Day, that after a period of adjustment to this new reality, the protagonist sort of breaks out and goes wild, right? This is how they'd behave in the real world if they could get away with it. Now, what does this behavior signal? Well, immaturity, right? Kevin is a little boy, so he's doing what any boy that age would do. But Phil is a middle-aged man. I mean, how does Rita put it? He is a man of advancing years. And, in case we somehow miss that point, Remis underscores it again by having Phil say, I'm not going to live by their rules anymore. So Phil is acting like a 9-year-old boy, pretty much. Remis is really highlighting Phil in his, before state, before his character has arced, before the shift has happened. The repeats are being used to reveal Phil's character and to develop Phil's character. We have a series of shots here now in the film that show Phil behaving inappropriately, right? He kisses the landlady. He ignores the homeless man again. He punches Ned. He eats all the junk food he can eat, which is also what Kevin McAllister does. He gets information from Nancy Taylor so he can pick her up on the next iteration of Groundhog Day. Now, it's not a montage, but it does, click by pretty fast in terms of viewing time. All right, then we have a fourth repeat, and we're still in the first half of Act 2. But this time, we only see Phil at Hobbler's Knob, and we see him picking up Nancy. So this is a payoff to what was just set up. And we also see Phil say Rita's name for the first time, and he says it to Nancy when he's making out with her. He says Rita's name by mistake. This is where the love story kicks in, and it's this suggestion that there's going to be a love story that re-engages the audience, because there's a risk of losing the audience here with so many repeats. So this is what Harold Remis does. He teases us with the promise of a love story. Then we have a montage with an unknown number of repeats, and here all that the audience is being told is that this day is repeating over and over and over again, We're not seeing all the same events of Phil reporting on Groundhog Day. We just get the idea that it is the same day over and over. And we still see Phil behaving like an immature child. Now, it's worth noting that Kevin, who really is the kid, matures much faster than Phil does, and Phil's a grown man. So what does Phil do? He's stealing money. He buys a fancy car. He's picking up women. And then he begins to manipulate Rita. We've already seen him use the previous repeating days to pick up women, right? He sort of asks them questions like he did with Nancy Taylor. And then the next day uses that information to act like they know each other, and he picks them up. And now he's trying these tactics on Rita, but it doesn't work. And this is what brings us to the midpoint shift. Now, the midpoint shift is the halfway point of a story, and it's where something happens to change the trajectory of the story for the protagonist. Something has to snap Phil out of his childish, immature, irresponsible, self-centered behavior. And that something is Rita's rejection. She says, "I could never love anyone like you, Phil, because you'll never love anyone but yourself." And his response is, "That's not true. I don't even like myself." And this is the key to the whole story, right? I mean, this is what finally makes Phil snap out of it. Now, for some protagonists in other stories, just hearing a line like that from Rita would be enough to get them to wake up. But Phil is so deeply entrenched in his own selfish behavior, and he is so egotistical, that Rita needs to keep rejecting him over and over and over before he gets the point. There's a whole montage where she's just slapping him in the face. He's a bit of a slow learner, that one. So the lesson here for us as writers is this. The midpoint shift can be a quick moment that's delivered in one line of dialogue. Absolutely. Or it can be stretched out over a number of scenes, depending on what your story needs and who your main character is and what makes sense. Because remember, everything's in service of the story, right? Okay. And then finally, we get to the second half of Act 2. And this is when the protagonist has absolutely no control over what's going on around him. He's just trying to keep his head above water. The repeating days aren't fun anymore. Phil wants out, but he doesn't know how to get out. So we see now a series of suicide attempts, all of which are obviously unsuccessful. Phil is such a tool that the conclusion he comes to is that he must be a god. His opinion of himself actually increases, and he becomes even more insufferable. Now, as we would expect to see near the end of Act 2, Phil does finally hit his all is lost moment, which is the darkest, the lowest point in the story. It's also called the dark night of the soul. Now, in Groundhog Day, in my opinion, it's not particularly well developed. As I said off the top, because the movie spends so much time showing us Phil as a superficial idiot, we don't really get any glimpses of him even beginning to become aware that he truly does love Rita deep, deep, deep down. And what he really wants is for her to love him back. He's clearly interested in her physically, all on a superficial level, but we don't see him really become aware that it's genuine love that he feels. And we don't really see him struggle in any way with how to handle that or how to actually not be an idiot around her. So when Phil has this shift in his character, it feels almost like it's coming out of nowhere. It feels kind of sudden. And of course, the only way he can tell Rita what he thinks and what he feels is to say it to her while she's asleep. I mean, that's in character, I think. So that to me is where Act 2 ends. So Act 2 began on the first repeat of Groundhog Day, and it ends here where Phil is admitting that he actually is capable of a genuine emotion. Okay, Okay, so I hope that's all helpful. I certainly learned a lot by doing this analysis. I have to say I learned more from this movie than I thought I was going to. So I hope you guys learned something too. Melanie, what have you got for us this week?
Well, actually, I learnt a lot more from this movie than I thought I would as well, especially from, with my focus this season on subtext. And the reason I wasn't expecting a great deal the first time I watched it was because there wasn't that much to uncover. I thought that it was a very, everything about Groundhog Day was there for us to see. It was on the screen. It's a pretty obvious movie once you understand what's going on. But the more I thought about it, I think Groundhog Day is a good example of how the primary genre, which is an internal growth story, is presented in the subtext. So Phil's internal change must somehow be externally represented in the visual medium. So we see the genre through Phil's words, innuendo, and his general contempt for the people of Porksatawny, and also his change in attitude towards them and Rita as the film goes on. So it's Phil's personal growth that is the significant change in the movie. The time loop Phil finds himself in, or the repeat of Groundhog Day, is a metaphor for his lack of maturity and growth. His choice to be a rude and contemptuous person is a choice that he continually makes. And when faced with being stuck in the same day repeatedly, he's faced with the reality that life will keep giving you the same lesson if you fail to learn. So in Groundhog Day, the same lesson is the same day repeated. And Phil can't change the time or the place. So the only thing left for him to change is himself, which is a really tight constraint that the writers gave themselves. And I think Valerie's touched on that and talked a bit about that in her section. So let's look at Phil's arc. At the start of the movie, he's a douche. He's rude and has a high opinion of himself as the talent on the daily news, and he's very self-centered. This is represented or presented by the way he treats other people, and in particular the residents of Punxsutawney and the Groundhog Festival. He pushes everything away. He rejects all offers to be included or to be accompanied by other people. By the end of the movie, he is fully immersed in service to the community, and it's only then does the time loop break and he is able to move forward with his life. He's also able to demonstrate to Rita that he's a worthwhile partner. So Phil's trigger to change is the Groundhog Day time loop that he finds himself in. So we don't know what triggered the time loop, and we don't know the rules of the time loop or what Phil needs to do to get out of it. But by the end of the movie, we can guess why the day breaks, and we finally get to the 3rd of February, and his life can move on again. So Phil's internal change is complete. He has moved from a person who's self-serving to one who is of service to others. So Phil's journey from douche to all-round good guy mirrors the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief or change. The 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I could really see this through the movie. So while I'm looking at subtext, what I'm trying to do as well is pick out how we can see some of these things being shown in physical action. And I did some research, and I did think this myself, and then I did some research and actually found out that Harold Remis did use the Kubler-Ross stages when he wrote the film. So I'm feeling pretty confident that this is what he's done to base Phil's actions, or to give that direction. So on the 2nd or 3rd Groundhog Days, Phil is in shock and in denial, despite the evidence that he's living the same day repeatedly. We understand Phil's position because repeating the same day over and over is illogical, and it is not our experience of linear time. So why does Phil deny the change? Well, denial keeps the change at bay. Our characters can pretend for just a little bit longer that the change isn't happening, and it gives them time to absorb what's happening before moving into the other phases of grief or change. So next, Phil expresses his anger and frustration physically. He slams the mourning man into the wall and he punches Ned for no apparent reason. So this also happens at a time when Phil is realizing some of the positives, and I'll put that in inverted commas, of reliving the same day. So whatever he did the day before will be wiped clean and he can start again at the beginning of the morning the next day. So when he punches Ned, he's doing it because he can, not because he knows that there will be no consequences. So it's a sign also, all these actions also show how he has not started to grow personally and not extended out of his normal routine thought pattern or behaviour. Now, Phil doesn't spend a great deal of time in the anger stage, and it's probably the least convincing part of Phil's change journey. I think Phil's anger stems more from fear and uncertainty than from a burning desire to blame someone or something else for what's happening. Now, when Phil starts to use his situation to get short-term gains, he's in the bargaining stage. He's trying to play around with the loop, but he's doing it what he always does. He's looking, like I said, for short-term interests and short-term gains. This doesn't seem to amuse him or provide him with any satisfaction over time. He tries to use the information he gathers by taking advantage of the situation he's in, and he tries to seduce Rita. But Rita doesn't fall for Phil. And can I just say, thank goodness for that. I have to admit that I did really enjoy Rita slapping Phil's face a few times, because I think that's probably what he deserved. This part of the movie is where Phil's at his worst and his worst character traits come out. This part demonstrates how much work he has to do so that viewers like him. Well, that's what I think. The next stage is depression. And after his repeated attempts to seduce Rita fail, Phil is not having fun anymore. As we can see by the Jeopardy scene, he is so bored and he knows the answers, even though everyone around him is in awe of his brilliance. So he starts to snap at people and he's tired of nothing changing the outcomes. So he is not able to move forward. He's resentful and somewhat a little bit angry at his situation. And Phil uses the weather to describe his state of mind at this point in time. He says, and I quote, "You want a prediction about the weather? It's going to be cold, it's going to be grey, and it's going to last you for the rest of your life." He also smashes the alarm clock. Now, Phil starts to kill himself repeatedly. At this point, the reality of what Phil has lost sets in, and he would rather die than change. So this is how big this change is and how, the thing that he must do, this is how resistant he is to being able to change. And I think at some point he actually doesn't really know how or what to change at this point in the movie. Now, I think it's Rita who helps get him out of the depression stage of his grief, and she reframes the situation for him and suggests that he looks at it as a blessing. Now, eventually, Phil starts to accept this new reality. He starts to do the only thing left for him to do, and that is to change. He learns new skills as per Rita's list. He learns the piano, ice sculpting, and how to speak French. And Phil also learns to be of service to others, and he puts the people of Punxsutawney's needs ahead of his own. And we see this via his efforts to save the life of an elderly man, only to learn that some things are beyond him. Now, towards the end, Phil is trying to make everyone else's day the best it can be. Phil's self-improvement comes because of his acceptance of his situation, and that's why he gets to the point where he is of service to others. Now, I am not saying that Groundhog Day is a masterclass in the Kubler-Ross stages of grief or change. What I am trying to highlight is how this theory lies underneath the character development and supports the expectations we have of a morality redemption story. The Kubler-Ross stages are used as the basis of the subtext in Groundhog Day. Phil's action, which show his state of mind, are derived from the Kubler-Ross stages. And as writers, this is a powerful thing to recognise and learn from and also use. Now, Groundhog Day's use of the Kubler-Ross model is linear, and in real life, people do not transition in and out of each phase in a linear way. However, this will give you freedom to vary your protagonist's story arc and also understand the options you have to demonstrate how they are changing over time, and also what their changes in response to the initial unexpected event could be as their life starts to spiral into an unexpected path or in an unexpected way. Now, Phil must transition from selfish to altruistic, and this is presented in the movie by Phil rejecting offers to join in with others. And he moves from that then to accepting the call to be of service to the community and accepting his predicament at the end of the film. Now, just a quick word on some of the other subtext devices in the film. The weather. So the weather reflects Phil's state of mind, and it's also how Phil gets trapped in Punxsutawney. Phil knows he's out of the time loop when the blizzard has passed. The snow blankets Punxsutawney and the winter sun is out. Phil is also a weatherman who gets the weather wrong. Now, I don't think that this says much about Phil's forecasting ability, because we all know that the weather is the weather and is not always beholden to forecasts, but it is on theme for the movie. And Phil Connors also shares the same first name as Punxsutawney Phil, the groundhog. Now, they are both stuck in a situation that they can't get out of, and there is probably a bit more to explore there, or maybe not. It could just be a joke since it is a comedy movie, but I didn't get enough time this week, but it's worth pointing out that they have the same name. And then there's the poem that Rita says to Phil, which is the poem by Sir Walter Scott, and it exemplifies Phil's problem. And what, in summary, that poem says is that no one mourns a selfish person. And again, that is on theme, and it is really tight storytelling to find those sorts of tidbits to put into your story. And again, it serves the story and it serves the theme and the purpose. So to summarise, Groundhog Day is presented as a romantic comedy. What it really does, I think, is give us a chance to reflect on our own moral compass and remind us that each new day is a chance to start again and be the best person that we can be. So, Valerie, what action step do you have for us for this episode?
Alrighty, I want everyone to look at the complications or the challenges in the second act of your stories. Look for any repetitions and remove them if possible. But if it's not possible, consider how you can use the repetition in a new or different way to either complicate the plot or reveal something about your protagonist.
All right, well, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss La La Land. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and help us spread the word by telling your writer friends about us. For more than 70 hours of training and access to writing templates and worksheets, all for free, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/innercircle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find out about books to help you read like a writer, visit Melanie on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.